Welcome to another session of Haftarah study. Just a little bit briefly about what we're doing this year. This is a spiritual successor to Torah study, I suppose, and I think probably next year we'll go back to learning more Torah Parshiot inside. But we're talking about the Nach, the rest of the Tanakh that's not read quite so focused of a way. There's selections from the prophetic books that are selected to be read in synagogue, and they usually have some kind of thematic connections with the Torah portion, or in our case, actually today, some relevance to the occasion. And as I like to say, that's usually when people fall asleep in synagogue. It's usually read in Hebrew, can be really opaque to make sense out of, and it's seldom the topic of whatever drash or devar Torah is being given. But somebody picked these portions at some point and picked them to be read consistently, probably because they spoke to them in some way. So it's an interesting discussion and questions to ask about how it can speak to us today. We'll also look at how the text has spoken to, how the text may have spoken to the people it was addressed to at the time it was written. We can also think about how the text may have spoken to Jewish communities who read it as a Haftarah in between then and now. So the plan is to read, or is to talk a little bit about the Torah portion connection. We'll need a little bit of background on the book that the Haftarah comes from, and then we'll dive in and read and see what comes up. So the Haftarah we're going to read and study today actually would have been read in synagogues yesterday. So this is actually technically last week's Devar Torah. Yesterday was called Shabbat Parah, and it's the third in a series of 5 what they call special Shabbats, special Shabbatot, leading up to the holiday of Pesach. Now, they still read Parshat HaShavua, the Torah portion of the week, on those days, but they add a special maftir Torah reading, a special additional Torah reading, and there's a special Haftarah for each of these special Shabbats. And the maftir for Shabbat Parah, the reason it's called Parah is a cow, it's a heifer. And the reason we call it that is because the maftir deals with the ritual of the red heifer, the Parah Adumah. If that's not something you're already familiar with, don't worry too hard about it. Basically, there's a ritual slaughter of this animal, and its ashes are used for purification, ritual purification for people who've come in contact with a corpse. And the reason I tell you not to worry too much about it is it's really hard to understand, and in fact may be inexplicable. I'm going to quote from the Orthodox Union's website here about what the meaning of the red heifer is. It says, this is an example of law of the Torah which is considered completely above human comprehension. The paradox is that those who are involved in the preparation of the ashes of the cow become themselves ritually impure, while the sprinkling of the water with those ashes is used to remove contamination. It is an example of a law which must be accepted on faith alone. Now, obviously, that's an Orthodox perspective, but you get a sense of the way this is a really difficult section to explain. So we're not going to dive too much into the red heifer and its connections, but the Haftarah that we're going to read is the special Haftarah, and we'll think about what the connection to ritual purity and purity and the red heifer might be. So what we're going to be looking at, if you have a chumash in front of you, something like a book that's designed to be read in synagogue with the portions divided out, you'll probably find this one all the way at the back with the special Haftarah portions. And if you're in a Tanakh, you should turn to the book of Ezekiel, Yehezkel, and chapter 36. Chapter 36 is where we're going to begin. Of course, I'll have the text up on the screen for you. Welcome, Andrea. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Before we dive in, I want to give you a little bit of background on Ezekiel, because this is a book we haven't actually touched on in this course of Haftarah study yet. So the book of Ezekiel, like a lot of the named prophetic books, presents the words of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is identified as the son of Buzi. And Ezekiel was one of the Jerusalemites who were exiled to Babylon, along with King Jehoiakim in 597 BCE. So actually before the destruction of the temple. If you were with us last week when we talked about Jeremiah, one of the things that happened in the lead up to the destruction of the first temple was this sort of manipulation of the throne of Judah by the Egyptians and the Babylonians. So the Babylonians deposed Jehoiakim and exiled him, and put their own puppet ruler on the throne. And Ezekiel is one of the people from the Jerusalem court who went along into exile. So Ezekiel as a book is very weird, very weird. You want to get an example, turn back at some point to the first chapter of Ezekiel. You get some really, really trippy stuff there. Ezekiel is theologically challenging. It's sometimes difficult to understand. It can be bizarre. His literary style is really intricate. He deploys a lot of striking imagery and often a lot of metaphors. He's really a master of metaphor, including sometimes really extended metaphors. Ezekiel wrestles with the problems that were posed by the tragedy of Jerusalem's destruction and the Babylonian exile. Why did God allow it to happen? Why did God allow the people to be exiled? You know, what future is there for Israel? Like a lot of other prophets, Ezekiel attempts to justify the tragedy by basically arguing that it was divine punishment for the people's sin, and by pointing to God's mercy in future restoration. Ezekiel contends that God intends to uphold the covenant with Israel and will restore the people to the land, and actually goes so far as to describe the construction of a new temple at the center of the reconstituted Israel. And this is envisioned in great detail at the end of the book. The most famous chapter, the most famous passage you may have heard of from the book of Ezekiel. Welcome, Rachel. Good to see you. Talking about the prophet Ezekiel, from who we're going to read tonight. So the most famous passage you may have heard of is in chapter 37, and it's the vision of the dry bones. The vision of the dry bones is part of this section at the end where Ezekiel is envisioning the return and what it's going to be like. Do not take it literally. Like I said, he's a master of metaphor. The dry bones are metaphorical, although it does get read as biblical evidence, basically for Tchiyat HaMetchim, the resurrection of the dead that the rabbis thought would happen when Messiah comes. I encourage you, however, not to read it like that. Ezekiel is both a prophet and a priest, which is interesting and a little bit different from any of the other prophets we read. Keeping this in mind, I think, helps him make a lot more sense, because he cares about things that a prophet cares about, but also cares about things that a priest would care about. And remembering that will help make sense of some of his metaphors. On the one hand, he is really hard to understand. Like I said, chapter 1, you go read chapter 1, it is bizarre. He has visions of God and the divine chariot that become the basis basically for early Jewish mysticism in the rabbinic period, and also later Kabbalistic traditions. On the other hand, his book is a lot better organized than most prophetic books, whereas many other prophetic books show signs of later editors who have come in and kind of rearranged and manipulated things. It's not so much the case for Ezekiel. It's formatted as kind of an autobiography. There's a pretty clear and strict chronology throughout, where his earlier prophecies come earlier, his middle prophecies come later, and his later prophecies come last. Basically, God instructs him to speak to and act in front of the Israelites who are in exile, and that's what he does over about a 20-year career. Like I said, it's organized chronologically, although there's one notable exception to this. There's one chapter that seems out of place, and the thinking is that's an example of a later editor. It's really obvious because it's one chapter out of the whole scheme that seems out of place. So he had about a 20-year career, and his 48 chapters are divided into 3 major parts. First, about 24, so the first half of the book, are oracles of judgment against Jerusalem and Israel, so very much in keeping with the themes of other prophetic books. Exile and destruction are Israel's fault for their bad behavior, things like that. 25 to 32 are oracles against the nations, also in keeping with the themes of other prophetic books, that they're going to, they've been employed as essentially God's agents of punishment against Israel, but we'll also get what's coming to them eventually. And the section that our Haftarah is going to come from is the last one. It begins about chapter 33. We're going to read in 36. These are oracles all about the restoration of Jerusalem, the restoration of Israel, and the temple as in Jerusalem as a part of that, and sort of Israel and temple as a focal point, as almost like the center of the world in Ezekiel's imagined future. Okay, that's what I have to say about Ezekiel the prophet. What questions do you have about Ezekiel, about his book, about timeline, anything along those lines? Please, Leah. Yeah.
Was he the prophet who had that vision with the chariots and everything?
Yeah, that's chapter 1.
Okay. Oh, all right. All right.
Check it out after this. It's weird. I mean, it's the fun kind of weird, I think, but it is very weird. Yeah, he's that guy.
Okay.
Okay. So our specific Haftarah selection, like I said, it's going to be in chapter 36 of Ezekiel. We're going to begin at verse 16. There are slightly different traditions between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. I think the Ashkenazim read 2 more verses at the end of this, but it doesn't make a big difference. So we're going to start at 36:16. And as far as background, like I said, this is one of the oracles about restoration of Jerusalem. The individual oracles within all these major sections begin with a formula, which is the word of the Lord came to me, and it's in Ezekiel speaking in the first person. And so our Haftarah begins exactly like that. Let me call up a screen share here, and we'll take a look at the text. All right. Can I get a volunteer? I've chunked it up into fairly small bits because there's some pretty intricate metaphors, I think, being employed here. Can I get a volunteer to read just those first 2 verses, source number 1? Oh, Andrea wants to read. Go ahead, Andrea, please.
The word of the Lord came to me. O mortal, when the house of Israel dealt on their own soil, they defiled it with their ways and their deeds. Their ways were in my sight like the uncleanliness of a menstruous woman. So I poured out my wrath on them for the blood which they shed upon their land and for the fetishes with which they defiled it.
Okay, so I want to, before we dive into any discussion, I just want to name that this language about the uncleanness of a menstruous woman sucks and is not great from our perspective. So I just want to name that. This translation chooses to use the word uncleanness. I think something like impurity might be a little better, still not great. I try to use the Hebrew word tum'ah. Here the Hebrew is tum'ah tanida, because it doesn't have that kind of English valence of something sort of illicit or which obviously is not even what they were going for, and certainly not what we were going for. But Ezekiel uses it as imagery and metaphor. So what sort of imagery do you see here in this passage that Ezekiel uses to describe Israel's sins? There's few enough here. You don't have to wait for me to call on you. You can just speak up. Go ahead and take yourself off of me. What sort of imagery do we see here?
A lot of spilled blood.
Yeah. So what kinds of blood? Because I think there might be more than one kind.
Menstrual blood, and then blood of lifeblood. Like injured or killed.
Good, right, excellent. So blood they shed, I think is trying to get us to think of like blood from a wound, right? Good.
It's also the blood is on the land, on the soil itself.
Good. Mm-hmm. Good.
Home.
Right. Yes. Excellent.
Rabbi, can I ask you something?
Yeah.
This is very small for me to read, and when I go into view options, and make it larger, it shifts, and then I can't see part of the left side of it.
Huh.
And I think you can move it over.
Yeah.
I've seen that. Sometimes it comes in the center and then it gets moved over.
That's peculiar. I don't think I have any ability to move it around for you.
Okay.
So there might be some way you could shift around. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm sorry about that.
Leah, you can you can drag if you look. Well, I don't know what view you have, but I have this. The Haftarah study is up on the left side, and then a picture of Rabbi Phil is on the right side.
Yeah.
And there's two little white parallel lines between the two, and you can drag it so that there's more space for the page if you want, and make the view of the person narrower. That's one thing I sometimes do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have it as narrow as, I see that. I didn't know about that.
But you could also, there's different sizings. You can do 50%, you can do different sizings.
All right, well,
okay.
We'll just have to
keep playing with it.
Okay.
Okay. So good. So we have imagery of blood, and I think was Lisa pointed out specifically, blood shed on the land, right? Yes, blood shed specifically on the land, and it's the land that's getting covered in it, right? What concepts are evoked by this kind of imagery? It's a kind of a general question, but I'll see if you go where I'm thinking already. So yeah, okay, go ahead. What's evoked by blood and, well,
messy. It's messy and it's gross and it's scary and.
Okay, good.
Also, the word defiled. I don't know what the Hebrew is, but they've used the word defiled twice in the English translation. Good.
Okay. So I think you got one of the two things that are, at least for me, evoked by this metaphor, which is one, like violence, like scary violence, bloodshed, all that kind of stuff, and two, remember Ezekiel's a priest, so he deals in matters of ritual purity and impurity all the time.
Would this have something to do with sacrifice?
Yes, in a way. Well, I think we'll see that. Well, we might see that a little bit more. Maybe less with sacrifice and more with like proper preparation for sacrifice. Because remember, if you go back and read Leviticus, there's a lot of concern not only with the sacrifice itself and the ritual, but with the ritual preparation, the state of ritual purity that the priest or whoever is handling things is in. And they use words like that: defiled, uncleanliness. Obviously we're not digging too much exactly into the Hebrew, but I think he's deliberately trying to evoke this purity, this ritual purity metaphor to describe the sins that the Israelites are doing.
What about warfare? I mean, shed blood upon the land, people fighting each other and dying, and
so could be. So what is it that you think that they were doing? Like, what, just from this, what might have been the nature of the Israelites' sins? So fighting, violence, that's one idea, yeah.
Well, also they've had fetishes, which I take to be a kind of idol.
Ah, very good. Okay, so I did not get that at first. Fetishes I did not get at first. I was like, what? I did not. So I had to go to the Hebrew and look up the word used there, and it is gilulehem. It's like literally their idols. I don't know why the translation chooses fetishes. That seems that led me astray a little bit, but that is. The idea is idolatry. So basically, for the fetishes with which they defiled it, so basically the idols and the idol worship that the Israelites were doing is being described as a kind of defilement through ritual impurity and a defilement of the land, which is also similarly compared to blood and not only defilement through blood, but the sort of like Rachel said, the messiness of it all, right? Good. Okay. Here's a question to which I don't actually know the answer. So idolatrous worship is causing the land to become ritually impure. How might that be like shedding blood? I sort of get the ritual impurity piece, but the bloodshed, like, it's hard for me to connect idolatry and bloodshed. Do any of you have any thoughts about that?
Or are they connected, or is he just saying that they did both and both were bad in the eyes of Hashem?
I'm not certain. That's why I was curious what other folks thought.
With the blood, not so much with the idols, but it seems like it also, there's a sense of treating life with disrespect, of treating it casually, both treating the land that they've been given casually, but also treating their life casually upon it.
That's actually, I like that. And actually, now that you say that, I think that makes sense. It's going to tie together to the end of this pretty nicely. So I think that might make a lot of sense. Let's try to keep that in mind as we keep going. Okay. Let's take another section. Could I get a volunteer to read verses 19 to 21, source number 2 there?
I'll go for it.
Thanks, Nathan.
I scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed through the countries. I punished them in accordance with their ways and their deeds. But when they came to those nations, they caused my holy name to be profaned. And in that it was said of them, these are the people of the Lord, yet they had to leave his land. Therefore I am concerned for my holy name, which the house of Israel have caused to be profaned among the nations to which they have come.
Okay. So what is God's name? And I don't mean like you to tell me Yud Hey Vav Hey or Elohim or Hashem or anything like that. What is the idea of God's name here? What's Ezekiel talking about?
His reputation.
Ah, good. That's the word I came up with too. Is something like reputation. How has God's name been profaned? Or how has God's reputation been besmirched, I guess?
Well, the people that he's treated so carefully have disrespected the gifts.
Okay, that's kind of what I would have thought, right? That the problem here would have been Israelite, like that their behavior was the problem. But I'm not sure that's actually it here. If we read closely,
it's because they had to leave his land. And he says that specifically, that they caused my name to be profaned because the nation said they had to leave God's land. So that means he doesn't have as much power as, maybe should be ascribed to the one supreme deity.
Good. Okay, good. So I think so this is actually really key and not totally obvious to me. I would have thought that the issue would have just like the offense would have been the Israelites' behavior. Mm-hmm. And that's still partially true. It's pretty clear that the house of Israel have caused this, but it's not the behavior. It's the fact that the behavior led to exile. And now the exile is making God look bad, right? Yep. For I think exactly the reason that Rachel's suggesting, that it suggests that the Israelite God is I guess weaker than other gods. God didn't even have the power to protect God's own people in the land that's supposed to be theirs, right? Didn't have the power to prevent the exile somehow. Notice that Ezekiel extends that ritual impurity metaphor. He's talking about something else. Like first the land was defiled or profaned, and now there's something else that's been also similarly tainted by the impurity brought about by Israel's sinning, right? It's God's name now has been somehow profaned or defiled. What does anything strike you here as theologically problematic? I mean, either from your own perspective or from what you imagine Ezekiel's perspective to have been.
It seems rather circular.
Okay,
right?
What do you mean by that?
Well, as if the exile is something that is God's will, and yet that exile is reflecting badly on not just the people, but on their God.
Right. So whose fault is that bad reputation?
Right.
You know, L'havdil, we're not saying this, but one might say, like, if we assume that God punished Israel for their sins and Israel's punishment reflects poorly on God, isn't this kind of God's fault? Like, obviously Ezekiel's not going to come right out and say that, right? And he has to make clear, and he does that, like, we're understanding this is Israel's fault. This is just like consequences for their actions unfolding, and that they brought this upon themselves. But I think it gives you an idea of what he's wrestling with here.
There's two things. There's
go ahead, Margaret.
God's viewpoint that they needed to be punished,
right?
And there's the nation's viewpoint that this profaned his name.
Right. Right. Yeah. So if we take both of those as kind of axiomatic, right, then God punishing the people is God profaning God's own name. And why would God do that? And I don't know the answer, but that's sort of what seems like still kind of problematic to me. And I think this just highlights the way Ezekiel is really wrestling with this. He's trying to figure out a way out of what's otherwise like a really theologically problematic problem, that God's supposed to be Israel's guardian and protector, and God didn't do that. So why, how could this have happened, right?
Well, isn't there also a concept of free will? I mean, God doesn't cause everything to happen. God doesn't necessarily cause all the bad behavior. People have free will to behave badly.
I mean, I would certainly subscribe to that perspective. Yes. I mean, I think this is, I think that's kind of what Ezekiel's debating. You know, I think it's one of the sort of base principles of prophetic text, that Israel screws up and God punishes them for it. That's just how the system works. But yeah, it does sort of muddy the waters around, I suppose, free will and maybe responsibility for what happens to the Israelite people. Is it just the people's fault independent of God, or is God somehow complicit in allowing that to happen? I don't have clear answers for you on this. I hope you're not looking for straightforward theology on this. I think this just sort of gives us a window into what's going on inside Ezekiel's mind here.
I'm a little bit wary of parental interpretations, but this one seems very much like, you know, when my own son screws up, whose fault is it anyway?
Sure.
It gets very twisted about where the blame gets laid.
I hear you, Lisa. I was thinking the same thing, because it's going to be, well, your mother didn't raise you right, you know?
Okay, so I'm actually, that's very gratifying that you both think that too, because that's also where I went with this. Especially as we read on, it's hard not to sort of read my own parenthood into this a little bit. So maybe let's save that line of thinking, that line of discussion a little for the end, when we start to unpack the whole thing and how does this speak to us?
We don't want to scare Nathan, who's about to become a parent.
Oh, no.
Yeah, right? Yeah, we're about to.
Trust me, I'm already scared enough.
The grand adventure.
All right, let's keep reading. Let's go on to source number 3 here. A few more verses of Ezekiel. Can I get a volunteer to read?
I'll read.
Please. Thanks, Lisa.
Say to the house of Israel, thus said the Lord God, not for your sake will I act, O house of Israel, but for my holy name, which you have caused to be profaned among the nations to which you have come. I will sanctify my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, among whom you have caused it to be profaned. And the nations shall know that I am the Lord, declares the Lord God, when I manifest my holiness before their eyes through you.
Okay, so this is like where it gets complicated for me to follow. So Ezekiel's continuing to use this metaphor. He's talking about sanctifying God's name, which is, I think we can understand to be the opposite. Hang on, I'm just going to shut the cat out of the room here. Okay, I think we can understand to be the opposite of profaning, making something not holy versus making something holy again. What's the significance of that line right in verse 22? Not for your sake will I act. What is the significance of that line? How do you understand it?
I'm not bailing you out because you deserve it. I'm bailing it out because you're making me look bad.
Right. Okay, good. So is whatever's coming, whatever's coming, Israel doesn't deserve it, but they're going to get it anyway. So usually I think we'd expect God to lift punishment, whatever punishment had been imposed for the bad behavior, because that behavior had changed or somehow they learned their lesson and were doing things differently. But I guess maybe it hasn't. Maybe it hasn't changed. It's not for that they don't deserve it. They maybe haven't actually learned their lesson, but the punishment's going to end anyway. I get confused at this point. I think we'll talk more about this, as we go. But this leaves me with some degree of confusion. Are you with me there? Is this making more sense to you?
Well, I mean, it fits with the second paragraph where he says, you caused my name to be profaned.
Right.
And now I've got to get my rep back.
Right.
And I just want to let you know that's why I'm doing it. Don't think it's because all of a sudden, what you did wasn't all that bad and I'm forgiving you and it didn't matter. No, what you did was bad. But if I come to your rescue, it's going to be to restore my reputation. So
yeah,
it's basically saying, don't think this is all what you did was nothing and that I'm just letting it go. And I have to say, it reminds me of Moses, constantly, when the people screw up in the wilderness and he says, God, if you destroy this people, what are they going to say back in Egypt?
Yeah, that's good. That's good connection. Absolutely. Was that Lisa? Were you going to say something too?
No, what's interesting to me is where it says, which you have caused to be profaned among the nations to which you have come. It's like you've gone out of the land and you're behaving badly, and it's reflecting badly on the people and their God. But then, and you're still behaving badly, but then at the end it says, when I manifest my holiness before their eyes through you, as if through this act, your behavior is going to magically reflect my holiness.
Right. So this is where I get confused too. It's like their behavior when they were in the land is what caused the problem, and now it's their presence outside of the land that's messing up God's reputation. But are they still behaving badly outside the land? Is that what we're supposed to understand, or have they changed their ways?
I didn't
God
get,
says,
I didn't get a
they don't
sense of
deserve
that.
it.
No,
Yeah,
I
sorry.
didn't get a sense that they were still behaving badly.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't say that. It says
Right.
you behaved badly when you were on your own soil.
Right.
Now, maybe they still are, maybe they're not, but the text doesn't really tell us, I don't think.
Right. Right. So we don't really know what they're doing now that they're, if they've learned their lesson or not. But nevertheless, it's not for their sake. Ezekiel doesn't have God coming in and saying, okay, you get it, you've learned your lesson. You're ready to go back and rejoin. You can come out of timeout and rejoin the class now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what gets confusing to me. what do you think about that last line? When I manifest my holiness before their eyes through you. What do we think that means? Like, what does manifesting holiness mean? What's that pointing to?
It's hard to say, because before he was talking about you caused my name to be profaned.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'm thinking that somehow whatever God does through the people,
yeah,
it's going to make it so the nations no longer think what they were thinking before, that profaned God's name.
Right.
It's almost like they'll say, oh, he is powerful. He can do this stuff. He
Sure.
could put them back in their land if he wants. And that's going to show he's holy, not necessarily that he does anything that we would consider righteous or virtuous. It's
Sure.
more about, that he's omnipotent.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Sure.
what I'm getting. Yeah.
Okay. Was someone else going to say something too? I'm sorry, I didn't see who spoke up. Oh, okay.
Well,
please, Leah. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking that their behavior would have to change. It looks to me like they were still misbehaving in the nations, caused
Mhm.
to be, it's the end of 22, which you have caused to be profaned among the nations to which you have come. It seems like, yes, they were in those nations and still misbehaving. So it seems like God would have to miraculously change their behavior. And also somehow it would have to be known that God did this.
Sure. That makes a fair amount of sense to me, actually, now that I think about it, that if the issue was idolatrous worship in the first place, then, imagine an Israelites in Babylon or whatever, if they're continuing to worship, other idols or things like that, I can see other people really getting the impression like, oh yeah, God must not be all that great if their people are going astray. But if they were actually back on, worshiping properly, although obviously they couldn't do that because they didn't have the temple or whatever that looked like to worship as properly as possible from exile in Babylon, I guess I could see that being understood by nations as, oh, God is so great, God's still worth worshiping, even when you're, I don't know. I'm not sure that, yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay, let's go on and read. I think, Rachel, you're on the right track here. So do you mind reading, see what happens?
Okay.
All right.
I will take you from among the nations and gather you from all the countries, and I will bring you back to your own land. I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean. I will cleanse you from all your uncleanness and from all your fetishes. And I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit into you. I will remove the heart of stone from your body and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit into you. Thus I will cause you to follow my laws and faithfully to observe my rules. Then you shall dwell in the land which I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God.
Okay. So you're absolutely right. That's what's coming. If the issue is I guess Israel's presence in exile is ruining God's reputation, then the solution is to restore Israel to their land, I guess, even if they don't deserve it. This section has some of my very favorite metaphor and imagery. Clean water. What do you think Ezekiel means by clean water? Now, it helps if you read the Maftir of Shabbat Parah for this. So if you haven't, that's okay.
Well, water was used to cleanse people from ritual impurities.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And what we know, well, at least from the halakha today, as it comes to be, it's the water that's useful for ritual immersion and purification is what they call mayim chayim. It's literally living water. It's flowing water. So things from like rivers and streams, the ocean, those are considered usable, but stagnant water, things like that, not useful. Moreover, in the special Maftir Torah reading about the red heifer, that's exactly what they do. The ashes of the red heifer are mixed in water, and that becomes the I mean, it's literally dirty water with ashes in it, but it's clean in the sense of ritual, its ability to ritually purify for folks who've come into contact with a corpse. So I will sprinkle clean water upon you. He's continuing to draw out this purity, impurity, priestly language metaphor. What do you think it means to give them a new heart? Give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you.
I mean, today I would read that as turning their heart back in the direction of wanting to observe the commandments, the mitzvot.
Yeah. So like, what are hearts for?
Well, I was thinking of turning back to loving God.
Yeah, but that's how we understand hearts. Hearts are for loving, right? They're for feeling and emotion and all that kind of stuff like that. So maybe give a new heart and put a new spirit is something like renew our affection, our care somehow for God.
It's also surviving.
Oh, okay. Say more about that.
Only with a heart of flesh can you really survive and really exist in the world, right? And
yeah, if you had a stone heart, you'd be dead.
Right.
Right?
So like, are you really living a life? Are you really alive and in this world and grounded?
Sure.
And unless you have that, and unless you find a path to observe and live a Jewish life, I guess, maybe under this interpretation, that might be a stretch, but
no, I like that. It's like God's going to perform a life-saving heart transplant here that is going to, I think Ezekiel's trying to be, trying to say like, this is like literally a new lease on life, right? Like this is, you're doomed down the route you're going. This is another chance to live again, right? To live longer. I think it's okay to read like that metaphor seriously as like it's literally a stone taken out of your body and replaced with a heart that works.
Yeah, and maybe also in a less like it's the survival of the Jewish people too.
Right. Sure. Yeah. We can sort of read the individual as standing in for the whole. I think that's a really good read. I think that's exactly what Ezekiel's going for. This like multi layers of meaning. Remember, so today we think about hearts as for love and emotion and feeling, right? In biblical language, they didn't understand what brains were for and hearts were for the way we do. The heart was considered the seat of intelligence, not actually emotions. Your emotions come from your bowels. Your heart is where you do all your thinking in biblical language. So I think if we sort of take it that way, this isn't just like an emotional reopening, but maybe like actually a renewed capacity to understand, God's ways, God's laws, and maybe understand the reason all of this happened. Like Ezekiel's sort of trying to explain it through these metaphors and saying like, this return is going to enable you to understand in a new way you hadn't before.
I was wondering whether, when we're looking at the heart, thinking back to the blood being spilled, whether they had a notion that the heart was what caused the blood to circulate, caused the life force to circulate.
I have to imagine yes, but I don't actually know. I mean,
they certainly knew anatomy, right? But
yeah, I don't know. I have to assume so, but I don't know the answer to that. But that would work really nicely with the earlier blood metaphor. You're right. Yeah. All right. Let's. I had one more question about this, which is that last line. You shall be my people, and I will be your God. What sort of formula is that? What does that remind you of?
Marriage.
Okay, marriage. Which is a kind of,
but it's also like a covenantal king with
right.
I don't know. With
Yeah,
maybe the
well-
lesser kings.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, God uses this language in Torah.
Yeah.
You know, that this, like, they say nearly exactly this, that you shall be my people, and I you know, you'll be my treasured people, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, all that, and I will be your God. Like, this is definitely supposed to evoke that kind of covenant language. So I think it's supposed to remind us of, you know, restoration, you know, revivification of that covenant. Let's read on a little more. Who hasn't read yet? Who'd like to? I think we'll all get a chance here tonight. Someone who's already read, who's able to? Go for it. Anybody? We're on source number 5.
Well, I can try it. I might stumble because it's a little small, but I can try it.
Okay. Go ahead, do that.
And when I have delivered you from all your uncleanness, I will summon the grain and make it abundant, and I will not bring famine upon you.
Mm-hmm.
I will make the fruit of your trees and the crops of your fields abundant, so that you shall never again be humiliated before the nations because of famine.
Thank you. That's perfect. So this is sort of interesting and came a little bit out of left field for me. That I sort of thought the reason for humiliation was exile, but actually there are other ways that God's reputation can kind of, you know, be smeared if famine happens, because I guess the presumably God is in charge of, you know, the rains and the weather and crop growth and things like that. So if there's a famine, you know, like famine in Israel that maybe doesn't strike the surrounding nations, that could be a source of humiliation and you know, defilement for God's name as well. Let's keep going. Actually, can I get someone to read? Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say one thing. It just makes me feel God's expressing a lot of compassion, where he recognizes that they've been humiliated.
Okay, good. This is building up to a discussion of like parenthood stuff. I feel like that's great. Okay, let's read source number 6, a couple more verses here. Who's got it? Maybe Andrea or Nathan or one of the folks who's read, or Davis, someone who's read before, want to read again?
I can read.
Go for it, Andrea.
Sorry. I was lost in thought. Where should I start?
Number 6, please.
Okay. Then you shall recall your evil ways and your base conduct, and you shall loathe yourselves for your iniquities and your abhorrent practices. Not for your sake will I act, declares the Lord God. Take good note. Be ashamed and humiliated because of your ways, O house of Israel.
Okay.
They are coming on strong.
Right. Yeah. So I find this part fascinating. So God's going to bring Israel back, and God's going to you know, cause all the trees and the crops to grow, and then you shall recall your evil ways and your base conduct. It's then, like, after the punishment, not only has the punishment been lifted, but like bounty has been stowed again. That's actually when you're going to figure it out. And that's like, I think that's the moment that Ezekiel's saying, that's when you're going to change your behavior. You know, like it's only after you've been restored to the land, like then you're going to feel the guilt that's going to provoke this change. You're going to feel the shame, right? So this is what got me on the sort of God is like a parent track here, because this in some ways feels very parental to me. Like I don't put my kids in timeout indefinitely, right, until they somehow demonstrate that they've changed. They can't, like, whatever they did wrong was in the context of, you know, play and just normal life. They don't actually get a chance to get it right, or to show that they got it right, until they get another chance to do that play or that sharing or whatever it is again, right? So keeping them in timeout until they sort of somehow figure out like that doesn't work. It's, you know, timeout is 2 minutes or whatever it is, and then it's back. The idea is like not to punish, but to demonstrate that your actions have consequences, and that when you misbehave in a certain way, that causes, this is what happens as a result of that, and to teach them the connection between their actions and consequences. But also, you know, as a parent, without abandoning them completely to those consequences, right? Like this feels very familiar. Like, yes, I want you to suffer just enough that you get it, but I don't want you to suffer. I'm still your parent. Like, I don't want that to be, you know, for that to go on forever. I actually really want to be able to shower you with abundance, right? I think moreover, like, you know, when kids are in timeout, they're really upset. You can't really expect them to think calmly and rationally until the consequences have passed. And I wonder if that's kind of what's going on here. Like, you can't really expect exiles who are probably rightly traumatized and upset about this whole experience to get it until they're back and secure and taken care of again, where they sort of have that capacity to think about and to process what happened. What do you think about that? We can sort of have the parenthood discussion here. That's where I went with this. I'm curious what you all think.
Well, as a parent, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm concerned by the fact that there's going to be showering of abundance, and yet, you know, maintaining the idea that there should still be shame and humiliation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It seems like, and the shame and humiliation, that will be your punishment. I don't know.
Right.
Well, I'm seeing that as a result of the new heart and the new spirit that God puts into the people.
Yeah, that makes
sense. Once they have that
sense.
new heart and new spirit, they're going to look at what they did before and go, "Oh, how could I have done that?"
Yeah,
I feel
That makes
so
sense.
ashamed.
got it.
I have to say, as a parent, it would have been nice to have had that power to, you know, sort of reach inside and change the heart of the child, but I didn't.
Yeah, I mean,
all I had was timeouts and taking away TV. You know.
I really like that too. That the sort of nature of the change from the heart of stone to the new heart of flesh is like it's a change from a heart that can't feel shame or humiliation to one that can. I like that. I like that interpretation because then it's all just a natural process.
Right.
Yeah, like it's learning from the consequences of actions.
Right.
That's good. All right.
I know. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, please.
Well, I was going to say humiliated has the same root as humble.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm thinking, you know, recalling and knowing it's not for our sake and thinking about all that it's being a humble in a way instead of, you know, things are restored and now it's joy and partying and, oh boy, like, you know, how kind and generous. It's like, be humble. This was not for your sake. I shouldn't have to do this. Be humble and admit that you are flawed and you got to learn, you know,
right.
Yeah, like going off that parenting thing. I think humiliated and humble,
Mm-hmm.
kind of linking that.
Very nice. And I actually haven't looked at the Hebrew roots there, exactly what they're trying to convey, but
Point.
no, I mean that certainly tracks in English.
It really, I guess it kind of bothers me that God keeps going back to, I'm not doing this for your sake. I didn't do this for your sake.
Okay, yeah.
And I think what I think of as parenting is, yes, I am putting you in timeout for your sake. It's a loving thing to do.
Mm-hmm. So actually, I had the same reaction too, and especially I was going to sort of bring it up right after the last section, which I think we can go ahead and read. I'll read this last section. Thus said the Lord God, when I have cleansed you of all your iniquities, I will people your settlements, and the ruined places shall be rebuilt, and the desolate land after lying waste in the sight of every passerby shall again be tilled, and men shall say, that land once desolate has become like the Garden of Eden, and the cities once ruined, desolate, and ravaged are now populated and fortified. And the nations that are left around you shall know that I, the Lord, have rebuilt the ravaged places and replanted the desolate land. I, the Lord, have spoken and will act. So that was my reaction to Leah, exactly, was that here Ezekiel, I guess speaking for God, returns and hits that note of, oh, but I'm not doing it for your sake, I'm doing it for me, which feels very at odds with how I understand parenting. Like I don't punish my kids for me. Like I can't really imagine being angry at my kids for their misbehavior and enforcing consequences on them, but then like rescinding those consequences so that other people would not get the wrong impression of me or something like that, as if they're going to say like, look how happy and prosperous Phil's kids are, like he must be such a great dad or something like that. That's like, parenthood's not selfish like that. Like that's not the kind of dad I want to be, or like I don't think anyone tries to be. Like I really do understand it as for my kids' sake, like to help them learn, develop a heart that can feel ashamed of misbehavior and understand the consequences of actions, right? This is a tough one. It like really doesn't resolve itself that way. On the other hand, like, I don't know, I think we kind of do sometimes judge other parents by their kids' behavior. If there's kids in the supermarket acting out, you're sort of, there's an instinct that's like, oh, they're really not doing a great job keeping their kids under control or whatever. So yeah,
well, looking back at an earlier time, and maybe in some parts of the world culture today, it seemed like there was a requirement to behave in a way that reflected well on your family, on your ancestors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not for your sake, but for the sake of family honor.
Yeah, and like Bible, it definitely works that way in the Bible's conception, right? I think it might have been you, Lisa, who mentioned before, like the honor that's reflected on parents by the behavior of their kids. Yeah, maybe this would have made more sense. Actually, maybe this is a good time to ask, our first concluding question, like, how did this text speak to people at the time it was written? Maybe they would have made that connection a lot quicker than we did. That like, we're supposed to be, this is our fault for not reflecting properly on our, parental figure being God. What are your other thoughts? If you were in Ezekiel's audience, an Israelite exiled to Babylon, how might this text have spoken to you at the time when, presumably Ezekiel delivered it? How might you react to it?
Well, it might depend on whether there was some kind of famine happening versus if things were in abundance.
Well, maybe, I suppose. I think this would have been pre-restoration. So that this would have been, you would have still been in exile in Babylon. So you might not even know what was happening in Israel.
Oh, okay.
Doesn't that last part sound like the restoration of Israel now?
Mm-hmm. When I have cleansed your iniquities, then I will people your settlements, and so I think that's coming. I think it's impossible to date this precisely, but I don't know. I guess I read this as like either restoration is imminent or on the horizon somehow. I think this is supposed to be reassuring, right?
Yeah.
I kind of wonder though if I would could this have also kind of been seen as like patronizing or further alienating because of that, like, this isn't really about you. This is about me, me, God, and like the sort of games I play with the gods of other nations or whatever. Like, I don't know. I like to think that this would have landed as reassuring, but I could also see it as like kind of patronizing or something like that.
Well, I think it does have this sense of all is not lost. You can still repair this by turning around your behavior and your expression of loyalty, and then things will be better eventually.
Good. Yeah. What do you think about, you know, reading this as the Haftarah for Shabbat Parah? How might this text have spoken to Jewish communities between then and now who read it as their Haftarah? There are probably a lot of other texts, or potentially other texts, that also deal with issues of purity or impurity. Like, why this one? This was tricky for me too, because the Red Heifer is weird. I kind of wonder if maybe like this is almost an attempt at like reclaiming some of that purity impurity language in a more relatable way, so that the Red Heifer and, you know, basically the whole system of purity and impurity was put in a suspended animation when the second temple was destroyed. So if you imagine reading this as a, you know, diaspora community sometime in the last 2,000 years, reading about the Red Heifer is sort of like, okay, this is a nice historical anecdote, but doesn't really do anything for me. So I wonder if like the way Ezekiel takes that purity impurity language and makes it reflect a moral or like an ethical dimension of our behavior instead of just sort of abstract impurity cooties. I wonder if maybe that like actually helps us get something more out of the ritual purity language in Torah that we read, by kind of going through Ezekiel's metaphor. It's kind of about the best I can figure. Otherwise, it's sort of like a lot of other texts, a message of reassurance. That, you know, God's still with us, God's still around, God plans to restore us eventually. How about any closing thoughts? How does this text speak to you now? I'm actually really gratified that some other folks read this, you know, went to the sort of parenthood side of things.
Well, in the connection to the Red Heifer, I mean, it was contact with a corpse that sort of jumped out from that, and as if now that they're in exile, it's as if they're dead to God, and that this is their way of, that by improving their behavior is their way to make it back into a relationship.
I like that too. I think that makes some sense. I could see getting that out of this as a, you know, medieval Jewish community reading this. I like that. Any other thoughts? What in here reminds you of anything contemporary or relevant to our circumstances? As a 21st century Jew reading this, what speaks to you?
Well, I think maybe if I've done something regrettable, and I might not be willing to see it and to accept it and acknowledge that I've done it. But if I can somehow get in touch with God, that could help me maybe not be so judgmental of myself, so that I could say, hey, yeah, I really did do that, and I'd like to do better.
Yeah, I like that. I like kind of reading this as a, like this almost would be a good one, especially the part about, you know, the new hearts and having that lead to, you know, awareness, you know, shame about, you know, what I've done and things like that. Yeah, this almost feels like it fits before in the lead up to the high holidays as a text about teshuvah, right? About reflecting on our actions and wanting to do better. I like that. I think there's something here to me, like I am sensitive to how the behavior of Jews reflects on us as a people and on our God, I guess, as it were. in the eyes of non-Jews. What I thought of was that, like, we're actually we're experiencing a tragedy, disaster right now with the pandemic, and even though I don't see that as defined punishment or consequences for any sort of action, I think there's a way that, like, how we as Jews react to that still feels important with respect to how others view us. Like, are we part of the solution, or are we part of the problem? Like, are we running around without masks on and flaunting restrictions that are supposed to keep us safe, or are we doing our part? Like, I don't know. I think about that kind of thing, about how the way I act reflects not just on me, but on my people. And it's not too far removed from thinking about how that might reflect on my God.
It's funny when you said that. I think every time I see a name, either on TV or in the newspaper or whatever, oh my God, is that a Jewish person doing that?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is a Jewish response to have, is to be concerned for our reputation, for God's name, as it were, right? Yeah.
Have you read about the controversy in Great Britain?
No, what now?
The statement, long backstory, but the statement was that Jews didn't need to be considered an ethnic minority because some of them are successful.
Aha.
And obviously the Jewish population was outraged.
Yeah. Interesting.
It started, they said this woman was the first ethnic minority to have office, and pointed out that there were several Jews that had been. And then they came back with, well, that didn't count. And to me, it seemed totally idiotic, because if that was accurate, then the United States doesn't need to do any more helping for the African Americans, because obviously after President Obama was, you can't get any higher
racism is over
than
now,
that.
right? Exactly.
So I obviously there would be millions of people would say that doesn't help me personally.
Indeed, yeah. Good. Well, thank you, everyone. This is a complex and interesting text. I enjoyed this one because it still feels unresolved in many ways. I feel like I have a lot left to keep thinking about, and I don't know. I think it makes me appreciate Ezekiel more. He sort of gets pigeonholed by the weird, divine chariot vision stuff, but I think this is really interesting study. He's wrestling with real issues, and really trying to make sense of the world around him, and his place and his people's place in it.